We are now going to hear from the newsmakers after having heard from the presenters. I just want to add one thing while they add various chairs, that in my work in international journalism, especially outside of the Anglosphere, I have to say that British broadcasting is usually respected more than American, just to follow up on that point. So now let's explore a little more deeply the implications for impartiality of the arrival of the opinion-led programming of the UK news channels that we were hearing. Is it an exciting moment? I mean, perhaps to allow new voices to connect with viewers, many viewers who maybe have felt alienated by the traditional players. Or is it going to create, and again, we were listening to it there, an American-style echo chamber promoting division and disinformation? And either way, is there really still a decision to be made, or has the genie been basically got out of the bottle? Now, our second panel could not be better placed to answer all these questions. Angelos Frangopoulos is the CEO of the channel everyone seems to be talking about, Disruptive GB News. Alongside him is Deborah Turness, who's been BBC's CEO for just over a year, and of course is the former president of NBC News, so obviously she knows a thing or two about what Americanized media might look like and what it means for BBC impartiality. And finally, Jonathan Levy, managing director and executive editor of Sky News UK. Jonathan took over running the Sky Newsroom from news channel legend John Riley back in the summer, and he's just announced a sort of new roster of appointment to view shows launched this month. Is it going to be enough to stop GB News taking more of their viewers? I'd like to welcome all the panelists to the stage. Thank you so much for being here. I think almost all your channels were mentioned in that previous panel. But Angelo, if I can start with you, and I'm going to start with you because, of course, you've been in the news the past few days. I mean, you're in the news a lot, but you've been in the news because you have been found to have breached due impartiality rules by Ofcom. It relates to the Saturday Morning with Esther and Phil program. Of course, McVeigh and Davis breached impartiality because they were interviewing the Chancellor. What Ofcom said is that appropriately wide range of significant views were not included. So first of all, what is your reaction to that Ofcom ruling?
Well, we're clearly disappointed by the decision by Ofcom. We chose to be regulated, and we take the regulations seriously, and we work closely with Ofcom as we work through each one of the cases that they bring before us. But the reality is that, you know, we set out to disrupt, and we set out to do things differently, because we're not creating content for this room or for other journalists. We're creating content for the United Kingdom, and we're actually addressing what I think is a really significant market failure. And the reality is, and it's a difficult truth for people to take on board, is the fact that the people of the United Kingdom want a service like GB News. There are parts of the Northwest, according to Barb, that we've been consistently beating the BBC News Channel and Sky News for several months. On Tuesday, we were the #1 news channel in the United Kingdom ahead of the BBC and Sky News. For the last 2 days, we've been the #1 commercial news network in the United Kingdom. So we are addressing market failure. In terms of the regulatory environment, we've signed up to it. But the word that was missing out of your description there was the word due. And that's a very contentious word, because due is supposed to empower broadcasters and program makers to be able to apply a layer of appropriate impartiality, and that is difficult to do when ultimately you've got a regulator that can basically say, well, we don't think it was enough, no matter how much you can argue that actually we did have other views on that television program. And look, and just another point too, Ofcom breaches are normal. I mean, Sky News has historically, they've been fined by Ofcom. They were found in the last year to have failed on due accuracy by Ofcom. The BBC has found itself to be duly unimpartial. So this is normal.
Sure, I mean, they've been around a slightly longer time, and I'm sure that they will reply to that. I mean, you have 6 rulings still pending. You've been found in breach of 2, 3 now with this one. And you mentioned that your channel is, you know, for the people of the United Kingdom. But this debate that you got in trouble for was actually looking ahead to the spring budget, and surely having an honest assessment of what might be in the spring budget, or, you know, the sort of ideas around it, is exactly the kind of journalism that the people of the United Kingdom want. So actually you weren't doing any of this in the interest of British viewers.
Yes, we were. Ultimately, we're here to serve the viewers, and that interview itself was actually, we're here to innovate. It was a very different way of approaching an interview. You had a centrist chancellor being interviewed by two MPs from another wing, of another part of the party, if you like. And after that, we did actually have opposing views, including from viewers.
So are you saying Ofcom was wrong?
No, we're saying that it's opaque in terms of the word due. And we have done a lot of work on this word due. And we even had in the previous panel, we're talking about what is due. What is due impartiality? It's not about balance. And this is the thing that is really misunderstood. This is not about equal time. It's what is the right amount of opposing debate, discussion that ticks the box. Now, of course, Ofcom's made a decision, and we obviously...
You've got 6 more coming.
We stand by that, and we've got more to come, and we'll go through each one of them one by one. But we are here to do things differently. This is the first new 24-hour news channel, with the exception of the short-lived ITV channel, to come onto the marketplace in 3 decades. And it was shaking things up.
That was pretty controversial.
Which one, sorry?
Al Jazeera English.
No, UK.
Okay.
Yeah. We're focused
They
on
had a
UK.
base here as well. Anyway, a detail. Jonathan, I was going to ask you, and I'm still going to ask you, whether you think that this distinction between news and current affairs in impartiality actually works, whether you think that viewers understand it. But I'd like your reply to what Angelo's been saying.
Well, Angelos talks about a market failure that just I don't recognise. I mean, I don't know what market failure you're talking about, Angelos, because millions of people, many millions of people, watch the Sky News, BBC News, and the kind of news that you're setting yourself against. I mean, I don't have the slightest problem with what you're doing or what you're offering. That proposition is absolutely fine, but it's a different proposition to what we are offering. And many more millions of people watch that on TV than watch GB News. I mean, that is the truth. Yes, you're right. There are days where in average share, and you referenced it on Tuesday, that on that day, that you had the highest average share of all the news channels, but you had the smallest reach out of all the news channels that are represented here. So it's just important to set the record straight. The market failure of which you speak, I don't think the facts support that. I just don't think that's true. So I think that while I'm hugely supportive of a kind of plurality of provision and different voices and in the market, I think that's a good thing. We just need to be careful that we don't let this idea set in that there's some kind of failure of what existed before Angelos and GB News came along.
Deborah, your experience is invaluable because, of course, you spent a long time in the United States, you worked in the UK in commercial television, and now you're at the helm of, the mother of all public service broadcasters, the BBC. So where do you stand? I mean, it's obvious where you stand on the impartiality debate because of the BBC, but of the changes that we're seeing, good or bad?
Look, I think speaking from the BBC's point of view, and my experience having been at the BBC for a year now, every day I find it useful to remind myself that the BBC is paid for by all of the people and must be there for all of the people. So in that regard, we're doing a very different job to the job that Angelos is doing, for example, which is not that. And so we've set out to really understand what impartiality means today for today's audiences. And it's very different. To their needs are very different to the ones they had even a decade ago. Piers, very eloquently, kept coming back to the point of fake news, disinformation. That's the problem. I think it has created a deeply sceptical audience. And so for the BBC and for me, I feel that the most important thing that we can do is understand the needs of that sceptical audience so that they can trust us. What we're talking about here is trust. Who is trusted? Does impartiality, and if you deliver impartiality well, does it lead to trust? And obviously, I believe it does. But I think it requires new things from us today. And what our audiences want is clarity in the chaos and a news brand they can trust. They want courageous journalism, holding power to account and really asking those difficult questions of all politicians and leaders who make decisions on behalf of populations. They want fairness and respect. And I think that's where we talk about impartiality in this room, but the audience don't talk about impartiality. They talk about fairness and respect. And the BBC must deliver fairness and respect and must represent a sufficient mix of points of view so that we are representing the debate. We are the town square of this nation and of the world where we are. We are the world's largest news organisation in the world.
You're
saying trust.
You're saying the audience doesn't talk about due impartiality. Do you think the audience understands the concept of due impartiality?
I think the audience understands, and I think we need to be more transparent about the work we do behind the scenes, by the way. I think they understand news organisations which strive to deliver fairness and respect. And I think that we've been talking a lot about transparency in journalism at the BBC and how we open up, not just what we know, but how we know it and what we don't know. And I think it's critical that today's sceptical news consumers understand the effort that is gone to in organisations that strive to be impartial, to deliver that news they can trust. And unless we tell them and explain and show how we are doing that, we haven't got a chance to continue to build that trust and grow it.
Jonathan, at Sky, you've just launched a couple of appointment to view programs. Some have launched, some probably will in the next few months. Is that shake-up a way to try to counter, what is a threat, I guess, from channels like GB News and Talk TV? Because they are, we can debate about the numbers, but they are taking viewers away from you. Are you worried about that?
Well, we're always conscious of the competitive environment. We operate in a very competitive field. We care about what our rivals are doing. Of course we do, and we're always looking at it. But our biggest focus is on our own game. We're constantly addressing and looking at what we're doing on different platforms. The audiences are changing. They're getting their news in different places. Much more, it has to be said, many millions more on digital platforms than they are on linear TV, which is what we're talking about mostly here. But of course, where we think that there's an audience to be had and that we can offer something better than we're already offering, we're making a change. As it happens, our audience is actually very different to Angelos' audience. There's very little exchange. There's much more crossover between the audience of Sky News and Deborah's organisation, the BBC News. Actually, if there was a competition for audience, it's much more there than with what GB News are doing, because the propositions are a bit more similar, and we're trying to compete. In the end, what we want to do is we want to be great at breaking news, we want to great at eyewitness journalism, and we want to explain and analyse things clearly for our audiences on all platforms. And we will look to do that in all the different ways and all the different formats and meet all the audiences on all the different platforms that we can do it. Of course, we're looking at what's going on around us, where our rivals are. And our rivals are kind of multiple in different ways on different platforms. GB News is one of them on one platform. Of course, we're looking at what they're doing.
Question to both of you. I'll just start with Jonathan. Would you have politicians as presenters?
No.
Deborah?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
Obviously. Angela, I'll just finish. Why not? It may be an obvious question, but why wouldn't you have politicians as presenters, and what do you feel when you see a channel that has them?
Look, I think not on the BBC's platforms. I don't think that represents BBC's values and what we're there to do. And I think if it happens on other platforms, well, it's for Ofcom to decide whether or not that's okay. But where it does happen, I think you have to make sure, if you are governed by a code and a set of regulatory frameworks, you are applying scrutiny, that you are holding those others that you might interview to account. And where that's not happening, clearly there is a problem. But we wouldn't, no, politicians couldn't host programs on BBC.
And it has to be said that the majority of the issues that GB News is being investigated for by Ofcom are to do with the crossover between politicians and presenters. Angelo, what is your aim with GB News? Because yes, you may claim that you're getting more and more viewers, but the viewership of news channels is never the biggest. So what is your idea for GB News in the coming years?
At a macro level? GB News as a business is misunderstood. We're essentially a digital business with a TV station and a DAB radio station attached to it. And we've just made, it was always our plan, but we've just made a very significant investment in digital. Our gbnews.com site is the fastest growing site in the United Kingdom news website. Last month, it was number 19, ahead of thetimes.co.uk. So we are a multi-platform business. And it brings into, it's actually a really interesting question because it then allows us to treat content slightly differently on different platforms. And look, I think that the most important point to think about in terms of where we are coming from, we're all about plurality. We're actually not really competing with Sky News or the BBC. We are offering something different and a choice to the marketplace. And my point about market failure was that no one was really doing that before. Nothing against what, I mean, most of my career has been working for the various Sky Newses around the world. But I think it's just what we are doing is different and addressing a different need in the marketplace.
Will you feel more comfortable if you keep on moving towards the digital? Because, of course, there you have fewer regulations.
No, but it's a good point. Because ultimately, we use what we do on our television business as really the source of most of our content. Now, interestingly, we've just recently announced that we're launching GBN America, and we will be making content, and we're starting the production process of making content for the US market. We've had significant growth in that marketplace, and we want to export thinking about British way of life, British politics, to the United Kingdom. And we've seen other brands been very successful in doing that as well.
Deborah, the BBC has quite a challenge because obviously, like I said, it's the sort of preeminent public service broadcaster around the world. I have to say that around the world it's often used and seen as a standard of journalism, but it's not without issues because the audience is changing, and sometimes its very impartiality is seen as lacking, and issues like the Gary Lineker affair don't help. So, for example, speaking of Gary Lineker, there was meant to be these social media guidelines passed for freelancers after that. Any news on those?
John Hardy, formerly the CEO of ITN, was brought in several months ago to conduct a review, an independent review. That's underway, and that will be reporting in due course.
But it does highlight that it's becoming increasingly difficult for journalists, who may well have an online presence or not, to be what is seen as impartial. Would you agree with that?
Look, I think we talked about the sceptical audience earlier, and I think it's about how we make sure the audience understands the efforts we go to. And I've worked in many media organisations and newsrooms now, as have my colleagues around this table. And I have to say, having spent my time at the BBC, the effort that has gone to ensure that we are delivering that global gold standard in editorial quality is astonishing. The level of fact-checking, data analysis, verification of any user-generated content that we use, and obviously that's a huge part of what we all do now. The verification is incredible, which is why we've launched BBC Verify. BBC Verify is part of a real push to say we're going to open up and show you the journalism and the checking and verification we do behind the scenes. We're going to put that all out front so you can see how we verify the content, so you can trust it more. And I think that the growth of Verify, it's only been out for sort of a few months now, but it's growing really fast, and we're hearing really good feedback from our audiences, and I think it shines a light to the way in the future that we must go in terms of sharing more so that we can be trusted to combat this skepticism, which is a natural result of all the disinformation.
Some might say it's also a result of having Tory connections in your former chairman and members of the board.
Look, I think that BBC's journalism, I am absolutely satisfied. We work incredibly hard to deliver impartiality. Sometimes outside of the BBC newsroom in the editorial process, there are different conversations that happen. There are moments where that's called into question. But the amount of work that goes on, and also, can I just talk about the safeguards? You see, the BBC is unique, as I'm discovering each and every day, and the level of scrutiny and accountability, which is quite correct, given that it's publicly funded, should give everyone an assurance of absolute quality and impartiality. There is an editorial guidelines and standards committee chaired by Sir Nicholas Serra that looks into every aspect. There is a complaints process. Ofcom, obviously, are the final arbiter. But there are checks and balances, and there is a constant conversation going on about, are we truly delivering fairness and respect? And I want to change the conversation from this idea of impartiality, because that's what's in our guidelines, but it's about what people receive from the BBC. Are we representing the views of the majority of people? Are we hosting the debate to the breadth that it's actually happening outside, in the real world? Are people finding that we are reporting on the conversations that are happening on the street and not judging them ever, but we are here to provide a service to every person who pays the license fee, and that's why it's so critical that we are held to account.
License fee is crucial, of course, because not everyone can work for public service broadcasters. Most journalists work for, I used to work for Al Jazeera. The money has to come from somewhere, and that I think brings up some interesting issues about due impartiality, because you could get a scenario where actually it's the owners of any news channel that pull the strings and make the news channel say whatever they want. So that's okay for the BBC or public service broadcasters. That's not going to happen. But Jonathan, Sky News is owned by Comcast, who also owns America's most liberal network, MSNBC. Interesting how in the UK, the two that have emerged have been right-wing. But anyway, can you see a situation in a sort of increasingly post-impartiality environment where Sky News might sort of fit that role that MSNBC has in the United States?
Well, I can't. I mean, the first reason why is Sky and Comcast have been hugely supportive of Sky News' editorial independence and impartiality, and in fact have protected it. When they took over Sky, they gave a 10-year pledge around Sky News' editorial independence and the establishment of an editorial board. I do think to a certain extent, though, and this was evident in the first panel, that impartiality is just presented as a constraint, and Piers made a distinction between impartiality and getting to the truth. I think they're connected. I mean, I see impartiality as open-minded, honest, curious, independent inquiry. That leads you to the truth. So, of course, there's the kind of regulatory sense of impartiality that we're talking a lot about, but it's a mindset, it's a touchstone, to use the word that you used at the top. I want my journalists to go into the world with that mindset, because they're more likely to get to the truth that way. It's not, I don't see it as shackles, to be honest with you, which is often how we're getting back to it here. I see it as an ideal that helps you do the best kind of journalism.
Could I just make a comment? Because I think, I'll back you up on that, because you actually said post-impartiality, right? So no one's talking about being post-impartiality, right? Because we're talking about fundamental journalism. Journalism should be about debating, looking at all perspectives. The issue is this regulatory layer, which actually I think weakens the ability of the broadcaster and the journalism to be able to use their judgment in terms of what due is. Right? So no one's talking about having no impartiality, because that would be really poor journalism, and that would not be what GB News stands for, nor what the BBC, nor what Sky News or any decent journalism business.
Can I just add one thing? As I said, I used to present the news for Al Jazeera for 16 years. Obviously, Al Jazeera not a channel without controversy, but I actually found great comfort in Ofcom's due impartiality, because I knew that regardless what the agenda of the people paying the bill was, I knew that I was protected as a presenter by Ofcom's regulation. And it goes back to my issue, news costs a lot of money. And in some countries you have public service broadcasting, in others you don't. And so actually the due impartiality laws I would put to you, or regulation, actually make sure that yes, we need people to sponsor news and to fund it, but it stops it being the mouthpiece of whoever is actually footing the bill.
So you at Al Jazeera needed Ofcom to give you journalistic protection from viewpoints that otherwise you would have been pressure being put on you. So we don't have that problem, because our journalism is independent.
Yeah.
And
can I just come in?
I think that's a really important point.
News organisations, we have great power, and with great power comes great responsibility. And I think the question for Ofcom is there going to be a clarity created between the organisations that dedicate themselves to deliver on the impartiality code that is laid down and those that do not? And I think that clarity for the consumer, with the noise and chaos, it's really, really difficult out there for our news consumers. They're having a really rough time knowing who to trust. It's worse in the US market. I am glad to be working for an organisation I know consumers feel they can trust, but we've got to work even harder to earn that trust, because it's getting more and more difficult and they're more and more sceptical. The noise, the chaos, the disinformation and the dishonesty out there creates a need for the pure impartiality, but I think Ofcom's challenge and opportunity is to create clarity between those that do apply the code and those that do not.
So is that what you would want Ofcom to do, create a delineation, basically?
I think it's the question for Ofcom as to whether or not that needs to happen and whether it will be beneficial for consumers.
Jonathan?
Well, it is a question for Ofcom. It's not for me to comment on how they regulate the market. It's for them. I think what we are doing is subscribes to the ideal of impartial news provision, and that's what we will carry on doing because it delivers the news that our consumers want, and that's evidenced by the amount of them consuming it, which is many millions.
Both agree that due impartiality, is there and is a good thing. But do you think that with audiences changing so drastically in the way that they get their information, and a lot of other changes to the news market, that it's becoming slightly anachronistic, that it needs to be updated one way or another? To both of you, yeah.
I do, hence launching Verify. And I think some of the conversation we're having around, it's not a table, it's a floor, is slightly anachronistic in that, you said it yourself, Angelos, we talk about news channel ratings. So news channel is a tiny fraction of the BBC's reach. Of course, we value all of our news channel consumers, but we reach 5.5 million average a week. We're still number one in the UK, but we reach 5.5 million a week on that. We've just launched a single streaming operation to reach our digital consumers via their mobile phones. One stream can reach 1 million consumers, and we're sort of powering up that operation to deliver multiple streams each day. So I think that the slightly anachronistic debate about news channels themselves, but I do think we need to continually challenge ourselves to evolve the journalism we're delivering. The core of the journalism needs to be good and true, but how we deliver it to our audiences so that they know they can trust it is our challenge. It is the existential threat and challenge to us.
I think where there's a danger of the rules becoming anachronistic is the big driver of the change is technology, really. It's different platforms, different technologies that lower the barriers of entry into journalism and allow views to be expressed more freely and more easily. And in that way, there's a danger that if the regulation doesn't keep up, that becomes an anachronism. I don't think the ideal of impartiality is remotely anachronistic. I think in a journalistic sense, that's as important now as it ever was and is the bedrock, the touchstone, to use your word, of quality journalism. And everything suggests that's what people want. Surveys suggest it. The audience for impartial news services suggest it. I don't think that's outdated in the slightest.
And Deborah, do you think BBC cuts threaten impartiality?
No, not at all. No, absolutely not. Look, the journalism is the lifeblood of the BBC and the quality of the journalism, the editorial standards. And like every other organisation in this room, we must make sure that we are using our the investment we have wisely to reach our audiences where they are as we evolve and shapeshift our organisation. It's a challenge that's presented to everybody, but the quality of the work continues regardless.
We're almost at the end of the session. Angela, the last question to you. I mean, obviously you are speaking in glowing terms of GB News, as I'd expect you to do, but you're still having trouble with advertisers. Many remain reluctant. We've discussed the Ofcom breaches. You had a bit of a car crash, one of your presenters. I always hate pointing the finger at one of the other presenters, but for a breaking news scenario which perhaps made it obvious that you don't necessarily hire your presenters based on their broadcasting skills, but maybe more on their political opinions. So in light of all of that, when you look to the future, are you worried about Ofcom regulations? Are you worried about basically Ofcom clamping down on you more?
Well, just on car crashes, we've had more than our share since launch, I've got to tell you, because we're a startup business, right? So we're 2 years old, we're a long way down the track, and it's live TV and things go wrong.
When you have a presenter who can't handle the most basic breaking news scenario, that presenter isn't there because of their broadcasting.
I think you'll find in that situation he had a lot of stuff going on in his ear that wasn't very helpful. As you would know as a presenter, that's not always helpful. But look, not our finest moment, but it's live TV. In terms of Ofcom, look, as I go back to the start, we chose to be regulated. We respect Ofcom. We have an ongoing conversation with them. We'll expect to get, it's going to be a constant conversation with the regulator because we are pushing the boundaries. We're doing things differently. And that is actually a really good thing for this industry. One of the first things we did before we launched was actually join the RTS because I really do believe that the more we innovate this industry, the more we challenge the ways things are done at the moment, the better it is for all of us, better for journalism. There's 200 and nearly 300 people who've got jobs over at GB News, a startup business. And that should be celebrated by the industry and by journalism, because it's actually a good thing, because what it means is that there's plurality. I fully support, I think what the BBC does is awesome, and what Sky News does is awesome as well. We just do different things, and we're all delivering a service to the people of the United Kingdom, and that should be a good thing.
We're going to have to leave it there. Angelos Frangopoulos, Jonathan Levy, and Deborah Turness, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.